Okay, hello, this is Dr. Sarita Jackson with the Global Research Institute of International Trade. I'm glad to have you here this afternoon for another episode of GRIIT Group Live. Today is very, very exciting after a couple of years of watching what for a while I was calling NAFTA 2.0, or what was often called NAFTA 2.0. Finally, the agreement has taken effect, the revised version of NAFTA. We are no longer operating just under NAFTA, but under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which took effect yesterday, July 1st of 2020. Hence the title of today's GRIIT Group Live, that the USMCA took effect yesterday, what it means for your business today. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, a day later, of what companies need to know, first of all, of what the differences are between NAFTA and the USMCA. For the most part, much of NAFTA remains the same, but there are some key differences that have an impact on producers in different industries or different sectors. So I'm going to talk about that. And there are 5 key things that I'm going to talk about. And afterwards, mention some of the resources, 3 resources to help you to get started, whether you are had already taken advantage of NAFTA and are trying to understand how to make the transition, or are looking to understand more about this agreement, the USMCA, to begin with, and to start exporting or importing, for that matter, and taking advantage of what we are now under the USMCA. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 5 things that I want to talk about that you should keep in mind, or at least take away from today's GRIIT Group Live. So the 5 particular areas that I'm going to focus on are: number 1, digital trade and intellectual property. So number 1, digital trade and intellectual property. Number 2, as it pertains to the manufacturing sector, what's called the rules of origin and the automobile industry. So I'll explain that. Rules of origin, very important, and the automobile industry. That's number 2. Number 3, labor requirements under the USMCA. Number 3, the labor requirements under the USMCA. Then number 4, agriculture. For the most part, what existed under NAFTA remains the same, with a few key changes. So there is a particular industry within the agricultural sector that will benefit from the USMCA. So that's number 4. And number 5, a very important difference, is the expiration date on the USMCA. So those are the 5 things that I'm going to cover now live. They will also be added in the comment section so that you can know exactly what was talked about and easily reference those key points. So the first point, the digital trade and intellectual property. Well, the whole idea behind renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, or one of the key ideas behind renegotiating NAFTA, was to upgrade the agreement, modernize it. And that is a positive thing, quite frankly, to see that here is a comprehensive agreement that addresses a 21st century global economy, and that's within the area of digital trade. So with USMCA, there are provisions. Now here I'm just going to generalize it. I will mention a resource that one of my researchers just completed if you're interested in more details. But for the sake of this session, it's just going to be very general, and then to allow if anyone has any questions that they want answered. But nonetheless, when it comes to digital trade, it's just this idea that duties cannot be placed on any products, any digital products that cross borders within the North American region between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So that's the key thing to remember when it comes to digital trade, that making sure that any goods that are, or especially digital products for that matter, when I say digital products, such as software, games, ebooks, things of that nature, that there are not any kind of duties placed on those products. Also, the other key thing to keep in mind when it comes to digital trade is that the USMCA prohibits any kind of discriminatory measures that make it difficult for, let's say if I'm here in the United States, I have an ebook I want to sell in Canada or Mexico, where there aren't any kind of discriminatory measures or practices that make it difficult because I'm not originally from, my product's not originally produced in Canada or originally produced in Mexico, where there are practices to make it that much more difficult for me, my digital product, to access that market. So that's another key thing when it comes to the USMCA. Also, the privacy protections, cybersecurity, the USMCA touches on that to make sure that consumers' privacy rights are protected, and that cybersecurity is a huge issue when we talk about digital technology, digital trade. While I'm all for it, and many of you may have seen the article that I recently published in a magazine that's also on the Facebook, the GRIIT Facebook page, but where I talk about digital trade, and that's a great thing. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm glad that the USMCA addresses that. But then there also comes the challenges with digital trade, and particularly when it comes to cybersecurity. So under the USMCA, at least from the negotiations and the signed deal and the deal that just took effect yesterday, that basically all three countries have agreed to collaborate to make sure that they address any cybersecurity matters. And then finally, when it comes to intellectual property, so I've combined digital trade and intellectual property. Now with intellectual property, just a slight change, that when for an author actually has work published, and once that person has passed, that the copyright terms remain for 70 years and increase from the 50 years after that person has passed. So those are some of the things to keep in mind as it pertains to digital trade. And I'm just looking here, I'm just seeing that some people are logging in. So, and as I always like to do, just take a quick second from sharing information to say hello to those who have logged in. So hello for those of you who are here this afternoon. And I'm just checking to see if there are any comments or questions from time to time that I may need to address. So, okay, so now I just see that people are here. All right, so I'll come back to see if there are any questions or any comments. Great, let's see here. All right, great. Okay, so for those of you, I see who's on watching, so I'm so glad. Thank you for joining me. So again, so that's the first thing when it comes to the digital trade. The second piece that is very, very important, and a couple of years ago I had a researcher where that was a lot of the work that he looked at. While I was focused on producing work on the agricultural sector, he really followed the negotiations at that time when the negotiations were taking place as it pertained to what I just mentioned, the rules of origin and the automobile industry. So first of all, let me explain what the rules of origin are. The rules of origin, or for those of us who are in international trade, we may just say the rules, ROOS. Basically, with the rules of origin, all that means is that there are requirements for a certain percentage of a manufactured product that must be manufactured within the region, any of the member countries. So here in North America, a percentage of the automobile has to be manufactured in one of the three countries, all three countries, but as long as it's manufactured in the North American region, in order to receive the duty-free benefit, meaning that that vehicle can be imported, exported from one market to the other. The person that's importing it does not have to worry about paying any taxes on that import, provided that that manufactured product follows and complies with the rule of origin. Otherwise, let's say if I manufacture the majority of that vehicle in a country, a non-North American country, then I cannot expect to bring it in through any of the 3 countries and then try to get duty-free treatment. So that's the whole point. So again, the rules of origin just sets the standard for what percentage of a product must be manufactured in that region, in the case of North America, in the North American region. So what we had under NAFTA, now to USMCA, is actually a stricter rule of origin. That was a contentious issue during the negotiations, where under NAFTA, the rule of origin was at 62.5%, and that has increased to 75% of a vehicle that must be manufactured in the North American region. And so when you go to one resource I'll just mention right now, the Office of U.S. Trade Representatives, or USTR, if you look at their explanation for the benefit of that, basically is that it will bring production back to not just North America, but specifically to the United States. So that was the reason for increasing that rule of origin, increasing the percentage that had to be manufactured in the United States, with the idea that it would bring production back to the United States, and of course benefit the automobile manufacturers here in the US. So that's the second point. The first one I talked about, digital trade and intellectual property. Then number 2, the rules of origin as it pertains to the automobile sector. So for any producers, manufacturers in the automobile space, or even automobile parts, that's something to make sure that you fully understand in order to enjoy the duty-free treatment under the USMCA. The third point, and this was a contentious issue even at the time of the discussion surrounding the North American Free Trade Agreement in the 90s, labor. Well, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, there were side agreements, labor and environment, that were tacked on to the final agreement, really just so that it would pass through Congress here in the United States. But the complaint was, there have been several criticisms of it, is that the labor regulations were too weak and resulted in many industries, workers in many industries, particularly manufacturing, here in the United States being affected by it. Weak in the sense of having to compete against the low-cost labor, the comparative advantage particularly that Mexico had when it came to manufacturing. So with the USMCA now seeks to remedy that with its requirement, what's called a labor value content rule, that applies mainly to the automobile sector. So again, for the automobile industry, any producer, anyone that's watching that's from that space, or anyone who has a client that's in the automobile sector, this is very, very important, is that with the new labor requirements, that 40 to 45%, and the reason why I mentioned that range 40 to 45%, it depends on the type of vehicle. So you have to go into the agreement and understand the type of vehicle. Now, a researcher, I'll talk about it later on when I talk about resources, but my researcher that was looking at this breaks it down for you. So you can always go back to some of the earlier work that GRIIT has produced on this, where he breaks it down for the different types of vehicles. But nonetheless, just for the point here, 40 to 45% of that vehicle, depending on the type of vehicle, must be manufactured by labor that is making at least $16 an hour. $16 an hour. Well, again, if you go back to the resource I mentioned, the USTR fact sheets about why this requirement was put in place, was with the idea that it will, again, benefit the U.S. industry, one, where much of the production will be here in the U.S., but then also where they will compete on what they call a level playing field, meaning that now you have producers that are competing with the same wages, but then the benefit would be for the workers here for the workers in that industry, where now they are making higher wages, okay? But then for consumers, then that may mean that the price of an automobile will increase, okay? But nonetheless, that's what the agreement says. And so for anyone in that particular industry, in that business, that's very important to know, to understand the transition, what the requirements are as it pertains to my number 2 point on the rules of origin, and then the third point I'm discussing now on labor. So now making the transition away from manufacturing to the agricultural sector. Agricultural sector is my fourth point. For the most part, the rules or the provisions that pertain to the agricultural sector in the North American Free Trade Agreement remain the same. Not much change there. However, for dairy producers here in the United States, where now with the change in one of the provisions, I won't get too technical, just keep it very simple, is that now the dairy producers have increased access to the Canadian market. So any dairy products, also poultry and eggs now have increased access to the Canadian market. So I'm just going to keep it simple. There are terms called tariff rate quotas, but I won't get into a lesson about tariff rate quotas. But just to sum it up, is just now the producers, the dairy producers, poultry, eggs are able to now have increased access under the USMCA to the Canadian market. So that's a benefit for producers in that particular space, that now they can access the Canadian market. And then finally, my fifth and final point with this agreement, whereas NAFTA took effect in 1994, well, look at how long it took for us to even revisit that issue of possibly renegotiating it. In the early stages, there are talks about the United States withdrawing from the North American Free Trade Agreement. So what we have now under the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement is what's called a sunset clause. A sunset clause, meaning that the agreement that just took effect yesterday will expire 16 years from yesterday. So 16 years, July 1 of 2036. So that's 16 years. That depends on how you look at it. Some view it as, well, that cuts into the certainty of having a trade agreement for a long period of time, but at the same time it creates some flexibility. And what that means is that it expires after 16 years, but the agreement is reviewed every 6 years by all 3 countries. And during that review period, either a country can decide to withdraw, or they can agree to extend the agreement for another 16 years. So that's the key thing to watch out for. So I'm just going to quickly repeat the 5 points of the USMCA that took effect yesterday that businesses need to know today and moving forward. So the first one, as it pertains to digital trade and intellectual property, what's called the rules of origin as they relate to the automobile sector. The labor requirement, again, as it pertains to the automobile industry. The few changes mainly for the dairy producers, poultry producers, eggs, where they have increased access to the Canadian market, but agriculture for the most part remains the same as NAFTA. And number 5, the sunset clause that places a limit where the agreement will take place expire after a 16-year period. However, the 3 countries will review every 6 years, and during that period, that's where a country can decide to withdraw, or the 3 countries can say, things are going well, we will extend the USMCA for another 16 years. So all of that, having mentioned those 5 points, the broader picture that I want to mention to companies and why the USMCA is so important is, number 1, for US companies, you have access to 2 large markets right here on each side of the United States. And then you have easier access to those markets and then a comprehensive upgraded agreement that addresses issues such as digital trade. Now, I've been following some of the discussions about the USMCA, especially yesterday, different news reports with opinion pieces and editorials. Now, it's not perfect, and as with any trade agreement, you're going to have different sectors or different industries or segments of society that may find that there's still room for improvement. Well, that's where the review period comes in. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but nonetheless, the thing that I do like about the agreement is that, again, for businesses to really take the time to understand how you can leverage the agreement, because it makes your access to Canada and Mexico that much easier. And then also it addresses what is going on in the 21st century, particularly as it pertains to digital trade. So that's why I think companies should, regardless of what you do with the information, at least try to understand what is going on with the USMCA, especially now since many companies are trying to figure out how to identify other markets to for their supply chain, whether it's other markets to import from, set up a manufacturing plant, or to export, whatever that issue may be, to really look at how the USMCA may be of benefit to you and your company in the global market. Now, before I get into the resources, I'm just going to take a quick second here, look just to see if there are any comments or questions that have been posted here. And while it is loading to let me see if there are any kind of comments or anything like that, I will go ahead. Let's see. Oh, great. Oh, okay. I can't overlook this. Okay. Hi, Art. Thank you so much. Tell Norm I said hello too. How awesome is that? That speaking of trade, that several of my fabulous contacts in the trade world, not just with Latin America, but all over Africa and Latin America, are on. Okay, and hi, Miss Jackson, saw you. So here's a question. So when the new administration goes, it can't be revised until 6 years. Well, 6 years from yesterday. Yes, so we have to wait another 6 years to revise. So this is a time, so this is a question. Thank you so much, Art, for that question, because that's a really good question. And this leads to the point of the work that I do. A lot of times when I talk to other business owners, actually I had a similar conversation like this earlier this week, where they'll think that, okay, the work that I do, they'll kind of not be quite sure. I have to explain to them why it's very important. But I also say, well, the policy aspect of what I do, yes, I help companies understand these agreements, how to leverage these agreements and become competitive in the markets with which the United States has signed a trade agreement. But the other part is for businesses to really follow exactly what's going on, because 6 years now there have been, and I've talked about it a little bit on some of my Facebook Lives last year, so the videos are still here on the Facebook page, about the role of businesses, especially the small, medium-sized companies, that the United States has set up a structure so that they can get more involved. And I actually attended one of those meetings last year as well, where they can get it more involved and have a voice on these agreements. So this is very important for businesses, let's say when 6 years or leading up, don't wait just till the 6 years are up, but leading up to that, to really get involved in the policy aspect. So if there's something that where the industry, your industry is impacted, for the industries to come together, small, not just the large multinational corporations, but the small, medium-sized companies, to attend those meetings. And what I will do, last year I did a lot of this, things have stalled, as you can imagine, this year, but to publish in my newsletter, I'll try to publish also on the Facebook, but a lot of times events go in the newsletter about when these different types of meetings are taking place. And I know last year they were all around in Los Angeles, and I think even outside of Los Angeles, but in Los Angeles County, they had several meetings where they had officials actually come in from Washington, D.C. to listen to the different small businesses about their concerns about international trade in general, and particularly with specific trade agreements. So that's just my addition to the question that was posed here. So yeah, we have to wait 6 years, but still it's a good idea for businesses when those opportunities arise to be involved, so that if your industry is impacted, whether positively or negatively, that your voice is heard, and then this information can be incorporated to bring about the necessary changes to the USMCA. So great question. Thank you so much. All right, let's see. I think that's pretty much it. So let me use that question also to segue into the resources regarding the USMCA, 3 resources put out by GRIIT that will help you to further understand the USMCA and to keep track of the USMCA. So one I mentioned, actually it's going to be a 4th one. One I just mentioned in response to the question, to follow my newsletter. I always encourage that, and especially when it comes to many of these technical meetings where you're meeting with officials from Washington, D.C. and able to voice your concerns and raise other questions about the USMCA specifically. To follow my newsletter, all you do is go to GRIIT.org, GRIIT.org. There's a pop-up where you can just insert your contact information, and you're on my free monthly newsletter, and that's where that helps you to stay abreast of some of these meetings and what's going on. The other resource, the main resource that I want to highlight, is I have a researcher that comes in from the legal side, and just yesterday he published a trade brief on the USMCA. So if you're interested in the details on the USMCA, specifically as it pertains to digital trade, you can just go to the GRIIT website again, GRIIT.org, go to the tab, research, then under that you will see trade brief, and there is the first part of a series, the one on the USMCA as it pertains to digital trade. So for any details, he gives a very comprehensive overview from the legal perspective of what's going on, but in a simple form, in a simple form of what the provisions are as they pertain to digital trade, what the trends are when it comes to digital trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and then offers very basic recommendations for businesses that are looking to take advantage of this agreement and are in the whole digital trade space. So he offers basic recommendations based on his analysis of the agreement, looking at the current trends and potential future trends, and then what businesses should take away from it. So that's a resource. Again, the trade brief, go to GRIIT.org under research, then trade brief under that, and then you will see USMCA. And if you're interested in the other work that I talked about, NAFTA 2.0, that gets into some of the automobile stuff that I was talking about. That breaks it down in terms of what the provisions, at least what were being negotiated. Things have changed slightly since the publication of that, but at least where you could see what was being negotiated in terms of the rules of origin for the different types of vehicles. So that's the other resource. Let's see what else. The interview with the guest expert, visit the YouTube channel. Leading up to, at the time, the early part of this year, was actually March, where I interviewed a business lawyer based in Mexico. Check that out because he talks about what you need to know. It was all within the context of the USMCA taking effect this year. So he provides very good information, simple and practical information about doing business, at least in Mexico. So that's another resource for you. And then the final resource is just reach out to GRIIT, GRIIT@GRIIT.org, GRIIT with 2 I's, as I always say, at GRIIT@GRIIT.org. You can email me and to learn more about who our trusted advisors are if you are a business and you are ready to go to export, import, or even invest in one of the 2 markets, Canada or Mexico. Reach out to me and I can put you in touch with one of our trusted advisors who can help you with what you need to do on the ground. Okay, so if there, let's see, are there any other questions. Looks like that was it. And thanks again to those of you who are on, who have taken time out of your afternoon to learn about the USMCA. So feel free, if anyone sees this video, even after I am done with the live session, feel free to write a question, add a comment in the comment section, because I do check and I will respond. And also the video will be posted on the YouTube channel. You can just find it looking up the name of the organization, Global Research Institute of International Trade. This video will be posted to the YouTube channel and on my Instagram page. So thank you for joining me this afternoon. I look forward to seeing everyone again in the next 2 weeks. And stay safe, have a great afternoon, and see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you again. I am Dr. Sarita Jackson with the Global Research Institute of International Trade. Bye-bye.